You're now live.
We are now live. Okay. I always get a little nervous when we don't immediately go to live. Welcome, committee. This is Senate Finance, and today we're going to continue our discussion of the corporate income tax proposed changes, despite the official title of the bill. And we have a change in order. Graham is still working as we speak with Tom Cavett. So we have asked Commissioner Bolio, and he has kindly consented to go first. And he's going to talk about, I believe, the single sales factor. And were you talking about, Chloe is not on here. So the corporate income tax?
Yeah, that's right, Madam Chair.
Okay, good. So the floor is yours, Commissioner. Welcome.
Sure, thank you. Appreciate it. Craig Bolio, Tax Commissioner. So I think, Madam Chair, you had originally asked for me to talk about the minimum tax provisions in this bill, and I'd also like to hit on the single sales factor because I was listening to some of the committee discussion on Tuesday. So I'll try to, I'm going to swap a little bit what I'm going to say because I thought I was going after Graham, but the corporate minimum tax, right, is essentially a gross receipts tax, right? It scales up as gross receipts go up. So, I'm sure it comes as no surprise to the committee that the governor is not really interested in having the corporate minimum taxes go up as part of this bill. And as you'll see from the JFO estimates later, the current structure of the minimum tax in this bill makes the corporate income tax provisions in this bill a net tax increase, which the governor certainly doesn't support. I want to be clear, the governor has supported other pay-fors, other elements of this bill that will increase taxes, right? Including the Joyce to Finnegan change and repealing the 80-20 exclusion, and even the fact that single sales factor has winners and losers within it. These are policies that the administration thinks make sense in the modern economy and form a cohesive part of an corporate income tax reform package that's better for Vermont. And if the committee has an interest or feels a need to make the bill revenue neutral, we had previously recommended adding sports betting to that, and I would continue to hold that recommendation. Gross receipts taxes make some odd incentives. Like they're going to create an unnatural pressure for businesses to vertically integrate so that so that different businesses don't pay tax on the same goods and services. It's called pyramiding. It also disadvantages startup and new businesses or just established businesses that have low margins. I know this committee has been interested in reading about the Tax Structure Commission in Vermont. I had done a little bit of reading, not a ton, but Washington State has a gross receipts tax, and actually several years ago, many years ago, I think at this point, had their own tax structure commission, and that found that their gross receipts tax created significant pyramiding effects, and they were disparate among different industries. So in the service industry, which are some of the big companies that will be impacted by single sales factor, it pyramided less than it did on manufacturing businesses, which is interesting. So while the rest of the bill in the administration's position is about making a better structure and a fairer system compared to our neighbors, I think increasing our reliance on a gross receipts tax could very well be argued to do the opposite. I'm happy to pause there. That was what I was going to say about the minimum tax, Madam Chair, before I jumped into single sales factor.
You explain a little more about the pressure to integrate vertically, the pyramiding?
Yeah, so if you have a gross receipts tax, right, it essentially means that one company's good that is a business input to another company, they're both going to get taxed, right? Because you're not going to be able to, it works a similar way to when you have like value add taxes, right? And you're taxing things at multiple levels. It essentially results in business inputs getting taxed. And so you might have the exact same good going through one production chain getting taxed at multiple levels. The reason they call it pyramiding is because it creates a scenario where you've got a statutory tax rate, but the actual tax rate that gets paid on that good or service is much higher. So again, not an expert in Washington State, but their tax structure commission had estimated that the pyramiding rate, which is the actual rate that is paid, was 2.5 times higher than the statutory rate on their gross receipts tax. And in fact, on manufacturing businesses, it was upwards of 5 to 6 times the statutory rate. So it gets challenging. Very few states have actually operated with a wide scale gross receipts tax for a while. They usually repeal it after a couple of years because of these kind of.
We didn't. There was a study commission many years ago when I first came here. At that time, only Hawaii, who has no neighbors, had done an overall gross receipts. And I can remember going to the House chamber to hear the results of the study. And that was the last I've heard of a proposal to go to gross receipts as a base tax in the state, and for exactly those kinds of reasons. So we may want to look at that. So what you're saying is, if there are a group of businesses all owned by the same corporation, but one of them harvests timber and then they sell that to a sawmill, that counts as taxable sales for that first company. The second sawmill saws it into logs. They sell it to a furniture manufacturer. That counts as sales. And then when the manufacturer makes a couch and sells it, that's a third tax on that same piece of wood in different forms, even though these might be 3 separate. It's simplified, but is that what we're talking about?
Yeah, and the issue there is if those are 3 different companies, right, they would each get taxed at that gross receipts rate. And so it's going to create a pressure for them to vertically integrate so that they're one company. And I want to be clear, right? I recognize that the minimum tax is not a straight replacement of the corporate income tax for a gross receipts tax, but it has similarities to that. And that's where we see the challenges.
Okay. So they might all integrate and we'd only get paid on the original sale price. Well, no, you wouldn't get paid until they sold the couch. Right?
Yeah, until the final
product becomes sales.
And it's less about the revenue impact there and more about the fact that you have a tax structure that's like unnaturally creating pressure for businesses to do something that they otherwise wouldn't have wanted to do.
Okay.
To do.
New points. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I really feel like, you know, I get the feeling from the committee. I understand the desire to make sure that companies are paying their fair share of corporate income tax to Vermont. And I've heard, you know, that's where the impetus behind the minimum tax changes are coming. But I really believe that these other 4 main reforms have those same goals in mind by closing, you know, Vermont specific loopholes, you could say, right, by swapping to Joyce to Finnegan to increase the tax base. So there's a lot of places where I believe that we could have agreement and that the goals are aligned with making sure that corporations are paying their fair share. You know, and on that front, to just speak to a little bit of what I heard on Tuesday in the committee on single sales factor, and I apologize, I submitted this late, but I did submit a very short document. I'm going to try to share it, Faith, and hopefully I'll do it correctly here.
It may be up.
Do you guys see a very small, it says single sales?
And it is posted.
Okay, great. So, you know, one of the things that there's a few things that I've been trying to highlight that I think that this data will help illustrate. One is what we're talking about with these corporate reforms, remember, are changes for big companies, right? Small businesses in Vermont are not going to be impacted by this. Most small businesses, most medium-sized businesses in Vermont are pass-through entities anyway, right? We have between 25, I think, and 30,000 pass-through entities in Vermont. But we only get about, under about 10,000, I think, C Corps filing when you count all the affiliates on unitary groups, between 10 and 15,000. So we're really talking about big companies here. But even within single sales factor, which is what you see on the screen, that is not just a corporate income tax cut, right? There are winners and there are losers in that. And we've talked a little bit about that, that the winners, the ones who will see their taxes go down, are companies that have more jobs and property into Vermont than they have sales into the state. The companies that will see their taxes go up have more sales into the state than they have jobs and property. So, if you're a committee member that is interested in large internet retailers or investment banks or companies who are selling a bunch of stuff into the state who have not invested in payroll or property, you should be interested in single sales factor. The economy is changing, and e-commerce means that we've got more big companies availing themselves of the Vermont market, generating income in the Vermont market without a presence here. And that dynamic makes single sales factor more important to ensure that those big companies, out-of-state companies, who are generating income in Vermont without a significant investment of jobs or property in Vermont, are paying their fair share, right? In our neighboring states, yes.
No, I was going to say, the word intellectual property came up, I think, with the 80/20, but there's a lot of companies selling music, movies, legal document services. Are those also, I mean, that's a major change in the economy.
Sure. And to the degree that those companies are not based in Vermont with Vermont jobs and Vermont property, but they're selling those goods into the state, and we want to make sure that those companies are paying their fair share, I would recommend that this committee be interested in single sales factor. Our neighbors have all made that adjustment. And as time goes on, our 3-factor apportionment formula is going to feel more and more stale. And I want to be really clear, that doesn't mean that the 3-factor apportionment formula has always been bad, right? It's reflective of a change in the economy. Traditional thought was that workers and property in a state means that, a company and the people are consuming state services, and therefore it should be taxed on that, right? But it's not now the most equitable result for in-state versus out-of-state companies, right? The current structure favors out-of-state companies. And we have other taxes, like the workers' personal income taxes, or the company's consumption taxes, the company's property taxes, that help pay for state services based on payroll and property. And I've heard, resistance or skepticism maybe from some members of the committee that companies will relocate here just based on this change. And that's okay. That's not the crux of the argument that we're trying to make. It's always really hard to prove that, but for counterfactual, right? So I'm not here to try to do that. What I'm saying is that the companies who have invested in jobs and property here are the ones who are more likely to see benefits, while those who have not made those investments may see their taxes go up. And that's why we really see this as a modernization, right? If you look at the document on the screen, in fact, we believe that there are maybe 3 times as many losers as winners under single sales factor. Admittedly, the impact to winners, generally Vermont-based multi-state companies, not necessarily Vermont-based, but multi-state companies that have a significant Vermont presence compared to sales, is higher on the average. But there are winners and losers within single sales factor alone. So, we really feel like this is a better reflection for corporate income tax to reflect where modern companies generate income, right? Just like we make individuals, if they go work in another state, report that income to that state, this would help ensure corporations in the modern economy do well. And if I could leave like one big takeaway, it's that if we leave this bill on the wall, we're going to please those big multinational companies who sell a bunch of stuff in Vermont without investing in jobs and payroll.
Senator Pearson, you have a question.
Yeah, I do. Elon Musk and I have a great average income. And so I'm wondering if you have another, could add a column to your table there that would show us the mean or median change in tax bill, because I'm trying to, if we're going to base some decision on the data, I think we could do with getting a better picture than the average will create.
Yeah, so I gave you a median on the gross receipt center. You're looking for median on the average impact as well?
Yeah, yep, exactly.
Yeah, I think we can do that. I'm not sure I could do that right now as I'm in here, but I think my team could get that done by end of day today.
Thank you.
I want to also be clear. The average impact that's shown here is just our 1 year of tax year 2020, which we have most tax returns in, but not all of them. And it's not reflective of what JFO has for their estimate on this. And I want to be really, really clear. I'm not presenting this to try to dispute what JFO is going to present. We're actually showing single sales factor as an up right now. And I don't believe that it will be an up in the long term. I do think that there are some unique elements of 2020 that make it look like that right now. So I just want to be really clear. I'm not trying to dispute what JFO is showing, and our numbers are going to look a little bit odd compared to what you see from JFO. But I'm happy to do that, Senator.
Okay.
Thanks.
Other questions? Senator Hardy.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Commissioner, can you just repeat what you just said? Your estimates are showing that single sales factor is positive net revenue?
Yes, right now for tax year 2020, which we have to use tax year 2020 because that's when we have market-based sourcing, right?
Yep.
So we can't go back to 2019, which has a fuller data set, but we have most of the tax returns in for 2020 right now. It's showing an up right now for tax year 2020. JFO doesn't believe that it will be an up. We also don't believe it will be an up moving forward. We think it's because we don't have absolutely everybody in there. And we think it's also because of some oddities for the pandemic influenced years.
Okay. I'll wait for Graham's testimony to continue that, because he's showing it as a pretty significant down, or everything's relative, but
and again, I want to be really clear. We're not disputing that.
Yeah, no, I hear that. And is there any analysis? I mean, I hear you and agree that Vermont companies that have property and payroll here in Vermont are paying other taxes into Vermont. And you mentioned that, and that's been something that I've been mulling, property taxes, payroll taxes, in other, income taxes or whatever. Is there any analysis that you have on that sort of looks more at the complete picture?
It's not, but one of the reasons that I don't think I've done that is that I think I see it maybe in a slightly different way, Senator, right? That the inequity that I see right now is that we've got a lot of big companies that are availing themselves of the Vermont market, having Vermonters purchase
right.
their
No, I
services.
get that. And I agree. I totally agree. I'm just trying to look at the Vermont businesses, they're sort of total tax responsibility in the state is beyond corporate tax. They also, if they're located here, have property tax and payroll tax, et cetera.
Yeah, doing that level of analysis would be fairly involved, right? Because I
Yep.
don't have all of the property that folks have.
You can't get it to us by Tuesday then? Is that what you're saying? Okay.
I don't think I
All
can.
right. So let me ask you about something else, because I keep asking every witness about this because I cannot wrap my head around the throwback rule.
Sure.
Because it seems to me like getting rid of the throwback rule is creating a loophole. The throwback rule is there to prevent a loophole, right? So why would we be getting rid of it? I know it's the smallest amount on this chart, but it seems to me that that is opening a loophole. It's allowing the possibility of a company to get away with not paying taxes on some of their income.
You are correct that the goal of the throwback rule is to try to reduce or eliminate nowhere income. I guess I'd have a few responses. One is, I do see a natural policy tension between single sales factor and the throwback rule, which is probably like the foundational reason that we think it's good to package it together. If you agree that where you avail yourself of the market is a better reflection of your income and should better reflect where you pay income taxes, then it's sort of arbitrary to require a company to throw a sale back when it went to another state just because of how they're taxed in that other state. The second piece is sort of a practical one, which is moving to Joyce to Finnegan. It's hard for me to imagine the throwback rule having a significant impact on preventing nowhere income after we move to Finnegan, because Vermont will look at every other state as if they are Finnegan, which, remember, expands the base quite a bit and really prevents a company's ability to claim the protections of 86-272. So then it's like, is the juice worth the squeeze for the state to administer that, for us to put out regulations, to put out instructions and have companies track that? I had a third thing and I've forgotten it, so it could not have been that important.
Okay. Oh, okay. Is the juice worth the squeeze? Okay. I mean, it's only $850,000, or maybe that's the estimate. I know it's the smallest one, but I still have, that was frankly, the one that I'm having the hardest time wrapping my head around, but okay. That's helpful.
I don't want to, I'm never looking to scuffle with JFO, and I would welcome Graham weighing in here, but my gut would say it could be even less than that once you move to Finnegan. I believe Graham modeled that as if we were a Joyce state, like under current law, which makes the impact larger. Again, not here to try to quibble with the numbers.
Okay, thanks.
Commissioner, would this be a company that sold goods in New Hampshire that were not taxed? No, it's not sales tax.
No, it's corporate income tax nexus, which it could happen if they claim the protections of 86-272, or if they otherwise don't have nexus. But the audience of that is going to shrink significantly once we're a Finnegan state.
Okay.
A Finnegan
So
state.
if we go to Finnegan, this impact is probably not worth administering in your opinion.
Yeah, especially
You
with the
have to
policy
administer it.
tension.
Okay.
Yeah, especially with the policy tension, it doesn't feel worth it to me.
Okay. Other questions for Commissioner Bolio? I'm not seeing any, so thank you. Graham's light has come on. This is like Hollywood Squares. Graham's lit up. Graham, hot off the press, what are we looking at? And I think first, were your estimates based on Finnegan or?
Yeah, so for the record, Graham Campbell from the Joint Fiscal Office. First, I just want to add one more thing with respect to the throwback rule. So I would agree with Commissioner Bolio that I think if there is any sort of uncertainty within the estimate for the throwback rule, it is that I guess the risk would be on the upside, so that this is likely overestimated in my opinion. But we estimate conservatively in our office, and this is based on actual Vermont tax data and based upon the experiences in other states, of which some of them are Finnegan states. And so we don't think it's a zero impact, but I think Commissioner Bolio is right that switching to Finnegan will make it more muted. I think the other thing I would add on the throwback rule is, theoretically, one argument for repealing a throwback rule is, suppose you're a company that was not previously doing any business in Vermont, and you did business in other states, and you had nowhere income, as part of your net income. So income that was not being taxed in other states because of lack of nexus. The moment you set foot in Vermont and do business in Vermont, because we have a throwback rule, basically what happens is Vermont's going to rope in all that nowhere income and tax it in Vermont, or put it part of your sales factor. And so the idea, or one theoretical idea behind repealing throwback rules, is that it's a disincentive for businesses who have nowhere income to set up in your state, because essentially you're not going to be taxed based upon your sales in Vermont. You're going to be taxed on your sales in Vermont plus everything else that's in nowhere income land. So that's one of the theoretical arguments for repealing throwback rules. And keep in mind that Vermont will, even if this bill goes through, with a throwback rule repeal, Vermont will still have a what is called throw out rule for the sales of intangibles in there. So you'll be repealing the throwback rule, but there will still be sort of things within our tax code which are designed to prevent or make companies pay tax based upon how much nowhere income they have. So it's not as if we are getting rid of every single item in our tax code that doesn't penalize nowhere income. We still would have a throw out rule for intangibles in there. So intangibles meaning sale of services mostly.
Okay.
So with that out of the way, I've posted on the committee's webpage, and I will share my screen.
Okay, yes, you are up there.
And I will zoom in for the committee. Can everyone see that okay?
Yes, that's perfect.
So first of all, I want to issue a couple thank yous here. First to the committee for being patient with our office on this. I will say this is one of the most difficult estimates I've done in 5 years of being with the Vermont State Legislature, because there's just so much information, some of it competing, and it's a relatively impactful tax change. So we spent a lot of time working on this. I worked with Tom Cavett quite a bit on understanding the impacts. And my second thank you is to the Department of Taxes for the amount of work that they've put into this to give us the most updated information as quickly as possible. It's been extremely useful in putting together these estimates. So with that out of the way, I guess the four estimates on the bottom, so throwback, repeal of 80/20, Joyce Finnegan, and the corporate minimum taxes, those are numbers the committee has seen before. What has not been presented is our estimate for the change in the single sales factor. And we are estimating at this point in time that in fiscal year 23, switching to the single sales factor will reduce corporate income tax revenues and therefore general fund revenues by $11.2 million per year. But once changed or once offset by the other pieces in the bill, the overall sort of corporate package raises about $1.67 million. So in fiscal year 23. So a couple words about the single sales factor. The first thing is this estimate in this bill, when it came to this committee in May of last year, had a single sales factor estimate for a full year of $19.3 million, so roughly $20 million. And that was on a corporate tax base that was smaller than this corporate tax base. So it was based upon an estimate from the January 2021 corporate tax forecast. And so the estimate here, I would say, is significantly less negative than it was last spring. And the reason why it's significantly less negative than last spring is because, from what Commissioner Bolio has said, is that based upon the tax data that we have for tax year 20 and the switch to market-based sourcing, it does appear as though the impact of single sales will be muted by increasing the taxes on entities that are present in Vermont but don't have much payroll and property. So think about companies that are in the finance and insurance industry, e-commerce industry. So we do believe, as Commissioner Bolio said, that those companies will likely pay more under single sales factor. And so that is an offsetting, increase in revenue from what we were expecting before. The reason why we are, not counting this as a corporate tax increase are kind of a few reasons. The first is other states have switched to single sales factor, and we have, lots of estimates from other states about what their impact was for single sales factor. And some of which are more recent, some of which are, some 20 years old even. And with the caveat that every state has different corporate income tax bases, but no state that we found in the entire sample of roughly 24 different data points from other states. No state experienced an up from changing this single sales factor. And the sort of median that we found, the median impact was a decrease in corporate tax revenues of about 8%. So what you're seeing here is an estimate that is a decrease of about 6% in corporate tax revenues. And so this is an estimate that is below the median for what we found for other states. And so that's essentially us, looking at other states, seeing that other states have not experienced an up in single sales factor. If we did, we would be the first ever to experience in that. And the second part that we think, we still are projecting it down here is because, as Commissioner Bolio said, even though the data from 2020 is showing us an up, there are things, within 2020 that Tom and I think are somewhat unique to tax year 20, namely the importance of e-commerce in light of the pandemic. We have a lot of the sort of offsetting ups are from companies, because of market-based sourcing, but for e-commerce type retailers, and then, companies that are more based online, we just aren't sure whether how their income, what their income was for 2020, whether that will carry on into the future. So we're sort of being relatively conservative on this. To give you a sense, prior to switching to market-based sourcing, so for the data that the tax department sent us last year for tax years 16, 17, 18, and 19, the decrease of corporate tax revenue as a result of changing to single sales on average was about 11% of corporate tax revenue. So again, we're at about 6% of corporate tax revenues here. So while it does look like a big number, we would say that this estimate is, amongst the other years that the tax department gave us is certainly much lower. It is also the lowest estimate, for single sales factor impact amongst other states. And so again, it looks like a big number, but we really do believe that the change to market-based sourcing will offset a lot of the revenue impact because of this. So, but I should say that this number comes with a lot of uncertainty because corporate taxes are notoriously volatile, not necessarily on an aggregate basis, but within corporate taxpayers themselves. And so in one tax year, a large corporation that was making large payments could have, significantly more, significantly less in the following tax year. And so that can really change the dynamics of, whether that makes single sales factor, positive or less negative. And so, but generally, Tom and I came to a consensus that, the bounds here are probably somewhere between 5 and 8% of corporate tax revenue, and we ended up deciding on 6. And so that's what you see here. So the overall corporate tax package in fiscal year 23 is an overall revenue increase of $1.67 million. I want to make one final comment to say that this is not what is drafted in the bill. So the effective dates in the bill that's before you make these changes effective for January 1st, 2022. I am showing you essentially the full year implementation impacts. And so to the extent that the committee, keeps, that sort of first half year implementation as the House did, then these would be, a little bit less than half of what these revenue impacts, because corporate taxpayers make payments at different points in the year. And so these are to give the committee a sense of what we project to be the full year impacts. And so I think if the committee moves forward with, the corporate tax package as a whole, one thing that I think you all should consider is looking at whether you want to keep a sort of first half year effective for the first year, having it be a half year effective, or making it a full year effective, as I'm sort of demonstrating right here.
Okay.
So I guess with that, I'll take any questions.
That will probably be the easiest decision we have to make. We've got a long way to go before we get to effective dates. Committee, questions for Graham? I can only see 2 of you, but okay, Senator Hardy.
Well, even though it's easy, the effective date, I mean, could we make it effective July 1, 22, or is there stuff that has to happen? I see the commissioner, you have to make forms and stuff like that. So I'm going to guess answer is going to be no.
I would plead, please do not do that.
Okay.
We always, I mean, at the department, we always want tax changes to occur at the start of a tax year.
Oh, right. That makes sense. January 1 is the start of the tax year. I'm thinking fiscal years. Okay.
So we would, I mean, I would very much encourage the committee, if they're interested in moving this forward, to please push that date out to start in tax year 23, because we're also going to need some time to update our regulations, all of that kind of stuff. Traditionally, as we've been talking about this, it's always been a future year tax change. I would very much encourage the committee to pursue that.
Okay. Okay, committee. Other questions? I'm not hearing any. And I can't see the committee. So maybe Graham, if you take that down.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So we all understand all of this, right? All right. It is a lot to wrap your head around. So committee. I'm trying to, we've got a few minutes. We've got more than a few minutes.
Madam Chair, does the commissioner have a hand up signaling a new question? Or?
Yes, he does. Okay, Commissioner.
Yeah, sorry to jump in. It's actually a comment, Madam Chair. Senator Pearson, my team was able to get those numbers you were looking for. So for folks who see their taxes go up, the median amount on that is 1,571. For those who see their taxes go down, it's 1,624. So it is different than the average. But again, they're very similar numbers. I'm happy to send that as a follow-up so you can see it.
Yeah, if you do, then we can post it and we have
that must be the median based on lining all the companies up.
Yeah, that's looking at each affiliate individually. So there's a bunch that have a small change, and then some that have really, really big changes, which impacts.
Well, that's the number I'd like. So could you line up the changes of the bill and give me the middle there? Because this is we'll just talk about it. I suspect there are in those numbers some that have a very big impact, and we'll never be allowed to see the names, and perhaps that's appropriate, but it's sort of making me uncomfortable because we're having potentially a significant impact, especially if you're telling me the median tax change is $1,000. But the average is 30,000. That is very telling, and I don't quite know what we do with that. Our practice is always to not understand exactly the payer, and that's appropriate. But it's a big, that's a significant factor of this discussion. And I don't know, Graham, do you have any way of helping me think through that?
I mean, I guess I have a little bits of information that were provided to me by the tax department. I think generally in corporate taxes, not just corporate taxes, all business taxes, this is with all like LLCs and pass-through entities, but with corporate taxes, large payers make up the bulk of the revenue. And so based upon the data that I have from the tax department, the top 20 payers generally have resulted somewhere around a third of total revenue. So top 20 payers, we have about roughly 13,000, 14,000 corporate tax filers. The top 50 account for almost half of corporate tax revenues. And so we're talking about a pretty heavily right or left skewed, of a highly concentrated top level for corporate taxes in general. And so,
Graham, are you able to give us that breakdown, the impact for the top 20, the impact for everybody else?
I don't believe I have the information to show you the impact, the tax impact for the top 20 and the tax impact from the top 50. Tax department might have that data readily available, but all I have is sort of a sense of what the population is like.
We probably can get that, Senator. I'm trying to make sure that I'm understanding. I certainly understand that request, but you had made one before as well that I didn't quite follow what you were looking for. If maybe there was another way you could explain it to me. or if instead the top.
Yeah,
20
so you've just said that the average for the 500 some folks that benefit, the average bill was they benefit to the tune of 30,000, I think is what your table meant.
Yep.
And you just told me the median of that was a benefit of 1,000.
1,600. Yeah. Yep.
1,600.
Yep.
So that if the average is 30,000 and the median is 1,600, then there are some companies that get a whopping benefit, and I'm just trying to get a handle on that. And so Graham's just said that the top 20 corporations pay the bulk of this tax, or corporate taxes generally, and so maybe if that's already a delineation, or the top 50, maybe it would be helpful. Sometimes when we're making these tables, we delineate among sort of, here's where the real impact is, here's what it means for everybody else. So I'm looking for some of that breakdown. I'm leery of average, and now you've proven that I have to be very specific about what median I'm asking for, and so that's does that help?
Yeah, it does. So let me talk with my team and see what we can do about like top 20 and top 50. One thing that I would just point out is it very well may be that those groups change, right? It's likely not the same 20 companies before and after single sales factor. But just a caveat to keep in mind.
So if I can also just, go ahead.
Well, all I'm just trying to say is if the median impact is $1,600 and there's 4 companies that are benefiting to the tune of $4 million, that's the kind of thing I'd like to at least understand before we're making a decision.
Yeah, and I mean, I think all of this discussion is sort of highlighting one of the things that I tried to say at the start of even a few weeks ago when I came in, which is like, we're talking big companies here, right? Winners and losers under these policies are big companies. It's not the small Vermont companies. It's just the way it is with corporate income tax a lot. But yeah, it will reflect that.
Okay. Graham, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I mean, I have I get big chunks of information from the tax department. I'm seeing if there's anything that might be helpful here to talk to Senator Pearson's question. So the first thing I would say is, as Commissioner Bolio said, is that the answers will depend upon what tax year we're talking about. And so the distribution changes. Generally, from information I have from the tax department, is if we're looking at tax year 20, the main people who, on aggregate, who will receive a tax cut are those companies with Vermont gross receipts between roughly $1 million and $5 million. And those that will pay more under single sales factor are the larger players. So over 10 million, 50, 100 million in gross Vermont gross receipts. So that's under 2020. For 2019, so we're not under market-based sourcing anymore, is the same group that was benefiting under 2020 is still benefiting under 2019 tax data. So the group between $1 million and $5 million in gross receipts is benefiting quite a lot. But also some of the bigger players on aggregate are benefiting under the 2019 data. And so again, what I think you're seeing reflected here is sort of the base, the change in base of the taxpayers, right? So the change in base for the big players might include, in 2020, might include a lot more e-commerce internet companies because of market-based sourcing. But in 2019, because we weren't under market-based sourcing, the sort of big players may not include all those players. And so I think generally it depends on what tax year you're talking about. I think it's a separate question to talk about for the top 20. I mean, we can look at the top 20 players, whether they're winning or losing under this. But it might also be the fact in the case, at least on the data that I'm seeing, that even outside the top 50, there are, if there are, say, 1,500 companies and they're all receiving a tax cut of about $10,000, that adds up pretty quickly. And so that is, it will depend upon what tax you're talking about and what the distribution is in that given year.
Okay. Senator Hardy.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I like just when I think I understand it, then my brain like
They say something else, right?
yeah, and so can there are too many bills and things in my head that I'm trying to keep straight, and the interaction effects of so many things. Graham, can you just remind me the market-based sourcing switch that happened between 2019 and 2020? Is that true? Yeah, do I have that
Yes,
right?
it was
Okay.
effective for tax year 20.
For 20 was the first year. Can you just give me a thumbnail of what that meant?
Yes, what it meant was for the sales of intangibles, so services mostly, for companies that sell services, Vermont was going to consider a sale of a service as a Vermont sale if the service was delivered in Vermont rather than where the service was produced.
Right.
So like I've been using Expedia for this example. Expedia is based in Washington State. Customer buys something from Expedia, books a travel, a trip on Expedia. Expedia makes money from a Vermont customer. Prior to market-based sourcing, Vermont considered, when Expedia was filing their corporate income tax, Vermont was not considering that a Vermont sale because the service was produced in Washington. Now we're considering it a Vermont sale. And so you can see how this is such a big deal for large, not just e-commerce, but technology companies that sell, things like marketing and, other types of services.
And we're talking about their revenue, not the sale itself. It's a corporate income tax, not a sales tax.
No, so it's a corporate income tax, but even deeper within that, we're talking about the sales factor apportionment. So we are now saying, all right, for your sales factor, when you calculate it, calculate your sales factor, the numerator, calculate that numerator, based upon where the sales were delivered in Vermont, not where those sales were produced. And so you can see for those large technology companies or companies that sell intangibles, the impact of market-based sourcing is making their presence in Vermont look bigger.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why we see in 2020 a lot of finance companies, insurance companies, technology companies paying quite a bit more Vermont tax, because now Vermont is sourcing, you have more presence than we previously were classifying you as.
And if helpful, Senator, the policy overlap on these two things is the Venn diagram is very close, right? As you think about market-based sourcing, what did that mean? It meant that Vermont-based service companies were having to source their sales to other states back to Vermont, whereas all of our neighbors had market-based sourcing, which meant that they also had to source them elsewhere, right? So it's very similar to the single sales factor, which is that we have in-state companies who are selling things out of state who end up having to pay tax twice on that. And we have out-of-state companies selling things into the state where they didn't have to pay tax at all, right? So this is a very similar policy argument to single sales factor. And it's one of the reasons that many states move to single sales factor after they move to market-based sourcing, because if you buy the reasons for doing market-based sourcing, those same reasons apply to single sales factor.
Got it. Do you have that Venn diagram, by the way? Because the chair and I love diagrams.
I can probably find you a list of states with single sales factor and market-based sourcing. But as I had testified on before,
I want the diagram, the picture.
I mean, in the last 10 years, it's 18 states who have moved to single sales factor and 0 who have gone the other way, right? So I mean,
It's a
it's a
trend.
one-way highway right now.
As the fashion thing that pops up on my email says, it's trending. I should buy it. Okay, Senator Brock.
Just a question, Commissioner. Are there any states that have figured out a way to game the system in terms of what industries to attract to their state, or how industries do business that are in their state to advantage those states relative to others from a tax perspective?
Well, I think I would argue that anybody who hasn't moved to single sales factor at this stage is disadvantaging themselves, because their in-state companies are sort of hit twice now, in that they are paying into single sales factor states that they are now one of the out-of-state companies getting hit, and they're paying the three-factor apportionment. One that I would point out, I haven't studied this a lot, but Massachusetts is really interesting in that they enacted single sales factor, but just for industries in which they wanted to be particularly protectionist. So they implemented single sales factor for manufacturing, financial services, and defense contractors, and everybody else has a three-factor apportionment formula. So, that's one of the states that has tried to like pick and choose here. I'm not sure how effective that's been for them, but it's, in my eyes, it's them signaling like, hey, we recognize that the three-factor apportionment is not necessarily equitable in the modern economy for our in-state businesses that are at least in these industries.
Would that suggest that there may be certain industries such as maple syrup production that we might want to do differently?
To the extent that they are shipping them out of state and they've got a lot of jobs and property here, I would encourage you to enact single sales factor to provide tax relief to those businesses.
You might find dairy products and chutney recently fix in there. Okay. Other questions for the commissioner? Our next set of witnesses is coming along. I believe next week, Faith, correct me, I'm putting this on for markup because I've found that tends to be the best way to get us, when we have to actually sit and look at words on a page, to focus and decide what information we need, what we don't have. If you have information that you want now, let me know and we'll line up witnesses. It's getting difficult, but to figure out exactly who we need to hear from or what information we need. But I want to keep going. Senator Hardy.
Well, Madam Chair, just curious. So S53, as we know, started totally different. It has a bunch of other things in there. Are you intending to just mark up the corporate income tax part of it?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't know what else is stuck on there. I know the cloud tax is. We can take a look before we vote anything out, but the cloud tax is just another one that is probably more complicated or will take as long as this one. I'm trying to clear out as much as we can. Apparently, we're living in a bubble when it comes to the student waiting, that things have gotten rather nasty down in education. And some of that will probably move to us when their recommendations come to us. So I'm trying to make sure that we can clear the deck of as much as we can. So when that comes over, it's still listed as a must do, but apparently it is getting difficult at this point to must do it in some areas. So I want us to have time to listen and keep open minds and to work our way through. So I think that's it. We've got about 3 minutes. You want to take about 3 minutes to stretch your legs and then come back, because we are going to start on weighting versus cost equity grants. And I believe we have the superintendents in today. So stretch, deep breath, and I'll see you in 2 or 3 minutes. Bye, Jeff. The committee's just on a short break.
Okay, thanks.
Somehow Zach doesn't seem to
Say.
have the link. I'll get him another copy.
No, they've got 2 minutes.
Oh, well,
I gave them till 2:30. So they can, it helps if people can get up and stretch. All right, Senator McDonald, we've got to do something about your background because yesterday your head was separated from your shoulders.
But you just have very good eyesight.
It's distracting to see a head floating in a snowbank, Senator.
But it's more distracting for me. You only have to look at it. I
That
have to
is true.
experience it.
Somehow Senator Sirotkin doesn't seem to end up with his head floating in the lake in Ecuador, but yesterday you were doing strange things with those backgrounds.
He has, yeah, Senator Sirotkin has much better control than I do. So,
Yeah, you do move a lot. All right. Okay.
I'm not sure I would agree with that.
Okay, Senator Sirotkin's back.
I never left.
You never left. Okay. So Senator Sirotkin is here, Senator Pearson. I need about 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm hoping I can get a couple more.
You're,
I think
if
we'll
you're
stop.
counting
We are
heads, Madam
still
Chair,
live.
do they have to be attached to be counted?
I'll propose that to rules. I'll get a ruling on if your head has to be attached along with being seen. The glories of Zoom. Okay. I'm going to call us back to order. And I'm looking for Jeff Francis.
I'm here.
You're here. Okay. We're going to hear today from some of the school superintendents. We are still on whether we should be looking at equity payments. This committee is not dealing with ELL. English language learners, grant versus weight is being dealt with in the education committee. We will have the bill and they will bring a recommendation to us. And then we will deal with what I gather has become a very contentious issue. We are looking at the other weights. We are still trying to understand how weights interact. I've seen a few surprises. Schools that thought they were going to, especially the poverty weight is the big one, thought they were going to see a big increase and doesn't look like they are. So we're trying to get a handle around what's happening. And we also know that schools have been under extreme stress and dealing with issues you never thought you'd be dealing with, and want to be sensitive to that. And so not throw you a curve that you have to respond to. The next topic we're going to go to that is in our jurisdiction is a phase in for winners and losers. That's a long tradition in the Ed Fund. We're presently cushioning any major changes you're seeing in your grand list over, I believe we do those over 3 years. It's been proposed we might do a transition over 5, but transition monies will impact the Ed Fund. So it's probably a good year to do that, but just looking for thoughts. And Jeff, I have you first. Do you
I'll make just a few introductory comments and then we'll move.
There you are.
to
Okay.
Superintendents. So for the record, I'm Jeffrey Francis. I'm the Executive Director of the Vermont Superintendents Association. We have with us today an array of superintendents representing various districts in the state and who experience or will experience a change in the education funding system differently. Some will see increased tax capacity. Others will see what's perceived to be decreased tax capacity. And I was asked to get a perspective from an array, and that's what I've sought to do. So we're happy to be here with you. I also, and Chair Cummings, you somewhat stole my thunder a bit.
Oops.
Because in the years that I've been working for the Superintendents Association, which dates back to the late 1990s, I've not seen a more pressure-filled time. So in a way, it's miraculous that we have these superintendents with us today. And while the association has really sought to make sure everybody was well-equipped in terms of information, we've got people at different places with regard to how they're thinking about the public policy change. Same thing can be said for me. While school districts have been contending with all forms of pressure as a result of COVID and its implications, I've found the velocity at the front end of this second half of the biennium nearly as complicated as I've seen before, in part because of big policy issues that are under consideration, including this one, but also because of the challenge of working in a remote setting. You just relate to the issues and to the people who are working on the issues differently. So that's a contextual statement as well. I want to commend the work of the task force, which I think has done a great job in laying out the considerations that need to be made. I want to commend the folks that are commenting on this issue. I think it's a pretty complicated issue. And I want to today do justice to the current perspective of the Superintendents Association with regard to our thinking, which is relatively simple thinking. And then have you hear from the superintendents with regard to what their experiences are on the ground. So let me just talk about a conversation that I had this morning with VSA's 10-member board of trustees, some of whom are with us today, where we talked about testimony this afternoon and sought to put together into a cogent explanation where our association is right now. And I would add that despite the fact that I talk about these main points from the association, it may be that specific superintendents are not in agreement with the main points because of what they're seeing in their own districts and how their own districts are responding. So I just have a few short points. Peter Burrows, who is the superintendent for Addison Central and our president, will follow me with any additive comments that he wants to make. And then we'll get right into having you hear from folks who are contending with everything that I said they're contending with, and also thinking about this transition in our education funding system. So the first thing that I wanted to say is that our current thinking is that adjusting the weights are a better mechanism for moving forward than the cost equity formula. And we're generally in agreement with the School Boards Association because we think that with all the pressure on the system and the need to achieve greater equity sooner, a transition to utilization of revised weights is a more suitable way to do that. We think that the school districts will understand the transition better, they'll respond to the change better, and we think we can get down to business, as it were, faster if we utilize a reliance on the weights as opposed to move to the cost equity system. So that's the first point that I wanted to convey to the committee. We also think, and Chair Cummings, you also referenced this in your opening remarks, we think that the work on the transition plan that will affect all districts, but in particular districts that will gain and lose tax capacity, is incredibly important. So you know from your own analysis that there are some big shifts in certain districts in the state in terms of gaining tax capacity or losing tax capacity. That's the nature of this change. We think that a transition is necessary, and we think that the presuming that we want to move to a more equitable system sooner rather than later, even with a phased-in approach, that the discussion about what the transition mechanism should be and what the costs are associated with that really needs to happen as soon as possible. You had mentioned, and I know that the ELL discussion is in the Senate Education Committee, and I'm respectful of that. I know that they're going to deliver to you a recommendation with regard to English language learners. But in our conversation this morning with the VSA trustees, we did touch on that, and I'd like to touch upon it now as well. Our general thinking at this stage is that ELL should be handled through the weighting system with a caveat. And that caveat would be if the hybrid concept that's been discussed is going to better be able to contend with districts that have fewer numbers of ELL students as opposed to greater numbers. We think that that analysis should take place and that that's something that everybody should be open to. We also, could not avoid taking note of the contentious nature of the discussion, as you characterized it, I think, with regard to how to deal with ELL. And our general point there, which I've conveyed to the Senate Education Committee and would be willing to discuss with your committee in more detail when and if you get to that point, is that our association has got a heavy emphasis on equity, and the state education funding system has a heavy emphasis on equity. And it seems, I want to emphasize the word seems, that the analysis that's been conducted by the experts that were engaged by the General Assembly to look at our current weighting system indicates that, particularly with respect to ELL, there's a fairly major adjustment that needs to be made. So I'm not qualified to challenge the analysis, and I understand and respect that the General Assembly may have a different way that they want to contend with it. But on its face, it seems that the experts have determined that we need to make a more sizable investment than we have in English language learners, and that determination ought to be adhered to. I will add parenthetically that we understand that there's a concern that dollars, really with regard to any of the weight adjustments, might not be appropriately invested. And having observed the education funding system for the years that I have, I respect that. And I know that some of the variability in spending in Vermont can be attributable to different patterns in different communities of voter interest, perceptions of capacity, and so on and so forth. That's what we're trying to get at with an adjustment to the education funding system. I think that that in order to get the assurance of proper investment, that the Agency of Education needs more capacity than it currently has. I do not think that currently there's enough programmatic support with respect to our key areas of investment. I don't think that there's enough monitoring in terms of how dollars are invested. I'm not a proponent of usurping local control, but with the amount of money that's invested in this state and the dramatic adjustments that you're going to make in favor of better equity, I think that accountability with regard to investment that incorporates the school quality standards, et cetera, is something that we should be putting more time and money into. And as a parenthetical statement, I would just add, if I would not have the energy to follow Brad James around, who's trying to do too much as a singular person with regard to this and other policy arenas. And I would say that illustration is reflective of what the AOE is challenged by currently, but would be more challenged by if, when this change is made, we want to get more emphasis on the quality of our investment and the results therefrom. And the last point that I'll make before I yield to Superintendent Burrows is that the recommendation from the weighting task force that goes to a mechanism legislatively derived that would provide for a consistent evaluation of the education funding system is something that I think is particularly useful and well placed. Right now, we're dealing with very, very difficult navigation from what was and is to what will be. And the swings that districts are going to see as a result of changes in their relative taxing capacity, I think moving forward in the future should be protected against by periodic and frequent evaluation of the functionality of the education funding, including and especially whether we can continue to operate with what we hope is the most equitable funding system in the country by making sure that we have the necessary recalibration of the system, in particular weights, if that's the way you go, but also other aspects. There's a lot to our investment in public education, and I would say that the legislature needs more mechanisms for oversight with regard to annual and progression of that system, and also that the agency needs to do more in terms of programmatic support and evaluation of the quality of our investments and the yield therefrom. So with that, I would like to turn to Peter Burrows to see if he has anything to add, and then individual superintendents will get into their perspective on all of this, and we as a group are available to respond to questions.
Okay, thank you. I was
Thank
going
you
to say,
very
you don't get off that easy. I'm going to ask the
no.
committee if they have any questions.
Not trying to get off easy. Thank you.
You've been here before. Okay, Senator Bray.
Thank you, Mr. Francis. Good to see you again.
Nice
You were
to see
so
you.
diplomatic that I wasn't quite sure what you were saying on ELL. So could you translate that into, a sort of a preferred path based on, what your group is recommending?
Right. So I testified in the Senate Education Committee last week, and I'll restate today. Because of where we want to be, where we are today, the need for equity, I think, expert counsel that you've received from Professor Colby and her allies, my belief, and I think it's shared by at least the trustees of the Superintendent's Association, is that we ought to be moving forward with a weighting system that relies on the weights that were recommended in the report. And we understand that alters the playing field, as it were, even more so than if the weights came in a different form. But, I would stand corrected on this if the information that had come from Professor Colby is challengeable. But our belief is if you've got empirically derived calculations of what the cost implications are, that irrespective of weights or cost equity, we ought to be putting more investment into English language learners than we currently are. So I hope that's clear, but that's our current stance.
That was very helpful. Thank you.
Jeff, you had put a little caveat at the end of that. When you first presented, it was provided, we should go to weights, provided that we can find a way to deal with those schools that have a small by comparison, since this is all done in percentages of English language learners compared to this, I believe there's 7, but there's a whole bunch that have a few. And any thoughts on what that might look like? Because I know at least one school I've looked at loses 92 students until there's an ELL grant, and just about breaks even if it's an ELL weight. And it's one of those schools that is poor.
Yeah. So we're deep into territory that we weren't going to talk about today.
Okay, so we won't.
But I will talk about it. So we looked at Brad's graph that he presented earlier this week that shows what happens to equalized pupils if the weights for ELL are considered along the lines of Professor Colby's recommendations. And one, I want to say that I'm glad that that these discussions aren't completed, right? So I know that Chair Cummings, your intent is to get a bill out by crossover. It's a thorny issue, right? So, but where we found ourselves in our conversation this morning is that if the state values equity, if the findings of Professor Colby are accurate, and we do need to invest more into English language learner systems than we have historically, then it's important to recognize that and make the requisite change. I think it's, maybe there's another way that we haven't thought of, or that you are going to find a better approach to introducing the equity into the system that the modification to the weights were intended to do. But I really think that the emphasis needs to be on transition. That's why my second point was get to transition as soon as you can after you make the policy decision about what method you're going to use, or find a different body of research that says that the determinations that were made by Professor Colby and her colleagues aren't accurate. Unless I'm missing some huge point. And I could be, given the pressure that we're all under, but I don't think I am.
No, I don't think we're going to start over with new researchers, not at this point. And we will start talking about transition next week. First, we're going to decide not for ELL, but for everybody else, if we're going to weights, or it's been suggested some things might be better with just a grant. But my intention is to do that first, and then we start transition, and that's all in the early part of next week. So our work is done when the recommendation comes over from the Education Committee. Hopefully we can just plug it in, but that may not be the case. But that would be my intention. That's the section they're doing, and we'll move on. So other questions? All right, I am not seeing any. So I'm going to move on. Peter Burrows from Addison Central is here. Welcome. And the floor is yours. We just need you to introduce yourself for the record.
All right, I will. Thank you. Peter Burrows, I'm Superintendent of Addison Central School District, and I'm President of VSA. It is great to be here and talk with all of you senators about this topic. So as Jeff mentioned, we spent a significant time this morning and have been talking about this issue for a long time. I was recalling the first time I heard about this when Professor Colby came to Lake Maury and did a presentation. I think this was pre-COVID. So it's something that superintendents have been talking about, have been preparing for. And I think it's been I think for some, it's been a strident call to make change right away. I think for others, it's been challenging. And Jeff mentioned this in terms of the varied impact that this is going to have on the state. I think you mentioned winners and losers. And I think certainly as a whole, superintendents have had a couple of years to think about what does this mean for our district? What is it going to mean in terms of taxing capacity? What does it mean in terms of programs that we either have and won't be able to sustain, or programs that we really need to address the significant equity gaps that all of us are facing in our schools? So I think it really says a lot about the Superintendents Association's support for this, that even though the impact is varied across our state, I personally haven't talked to a superintendent who's not behind the change in weights, who wants to see this move forward. I think the challenge for us as we move into the term transition and this moving forward is thinking about the impact on all the different districts and the support that I think is going to be really critical that the legislature gives to the agency to support districts and communities, because this is not just something that's going to fall to a business office in a district, but it's going to be a real community-wide change for everybody in both directions. And I know one of the things that has been raised throughout this process is, even if a district has the taxing capacity, will they use it? So I think there's a lot of community-based work that we need to do. And so the communication side of this and the specifics around implementation are going to be really critical. As Jeff said, I think staying with the weighting makes a lot of sense. It's both what we know, we've got extensive research on it that's had a couple of different iterations. I think it's time, and we fully support it.
Okay, thank you. Any questions? Not seeing any. So I'm going to move on to Libby Bonesteel. Welcome.
Hi, Senator Cummings. Thanks for having me. I just want to do a quick check because I thought I saw an email where Dave Young needed to go before me.
Ah,
I just want to.
No,
he's okay. I see Jeff shaking his head.
No, Dave Young is okay. Lynn Codem would like to go last. So I should have mentioned that.
Okay.
All right, then I'm good to go. I just want to make sure.
All right, I'll move Lynn down. All right.
All right. So hi, everyone. My name is Libby Bonesteel, and I serve as the superintendent for Montpelier Roxbury Public Schools. Just for a little background, MRPS currently has about 1,300 students, and 5% of our student population receive English language services. Since December holidays, we've welcomed 12 new students who are coming to us from Afghanistan, and expect more Afghani families to be settled in the Montpelier town limits very soon. As a result of these new families, we've recently increased our FTE for EL teachers from 2.54 to 3.0, and we'll be asking our community to permanently increase our ELL teacher FTE to 3.0 in the upcoming budget vote. This may not be enough to service our new families who have come in and need significant support. In other words, our context regarding English language learners is currently very dynamic because of the refugee resettlement efforts. In addition to our learners of English that's interested for this particular question regarding weights, Montpelier Roxbury serves Roxbury Village School that currently has an enrollment of 40 students. It's an extremely small school that's struggling to appropriately staff to meet the needs of students. Because of its distance to Montpelier, which is about 30 minutes away, sharing staff between buildings is not always possible. To put this into a budgetary context, it costs approximately $10,000 more to educate a student who attends Roxbury Village School than it does to educate a child who attends any of our Montpelier schools. Approximately 23% of our MRPS students qualify for free and reduced lunch. Based on the modeling of either weights or cost equity grants, MRPS would have a considerable tax burden increase for our citizens. So some ideas for the committee to consider when making your decisions with the context of MRPS. The Ed Fund formula is already complex that very few people completely understand. However, it's something that is a known entity for our budget creation process. MRPS supports sticking with changing the weights over creating a new grant system. We worry about any type of categorical grant that potentially increases reporting requirements or adds time-consuming processes to our staff in order to get the money. Because our tax burden is significantly increasing as a result of this work, taxpayers may not be so keen to add additional administrative staff to oversee cumbersome grants. Categorical grants may also silo students and our district's ability to meet their needs should the grant come with stringent regulations for how the funds can be used. It may actually undermine our inclusive education efforts. We have a couple of questions, one being that would adding additional weights for very small schools like Roxbury incentivize the status quo for small schools? The extremely small multi-age class sizes with a wide range of learning needs may not be sustainable from a staffing perspective or in thinking about what's best for learners. Incentivizing this through weights may work against the goals of Act 46. Based on the significant increased tax burden to MRPS, we would advocate for a 5-year transition period for any change. We are concerned that the excess spending threshold has always seemed overly punitive, and it would be appropriate to consider the change in weighting with the elimination of the excess spending threshold. The spending floor needs more definition in our understanding. A district could, for instance, have a prior year surplus or other increase in non-tax revenues, which could drastically reduce ed spending per pupil. And in this scenario, forcing a district to arbitrarily increase their spending wouldn't necessarily be appropriate. The committee should take into consideration the significant sway that students can have when moving into a district after the October 1 count. Much like our refugee families from Afghanistan, transitory families may in fact be more of a factor for more districts considering the current influence of the pandemic and what's happening in the world around us. Our district is in full support of making sure the students of our state who need the support get it by changing the weights. MRPS is interested in seeing a longer-term model of the effects of these changes. We are concerned that the long-term impact may be that a community such as ours that could support a significantly higher budget, partly due to the increased tax burden this change creates, may further segregate our communities because of high property taxes and a high statewide education fund need. I'm happy to answer any questions based on that testimony. I'm also happy to share that written testimony with you.
Thank you. Senator Hardy has a question.
Thank you, and thanks, Libby. It's good to see you. I don't know if it was your internet or my internet, so some of your stuff was a little groggy for me, but I appreciated your comments about the couple, well, all of your comments, but one thing, do you know if your small school gets the small school weight? Because not all small schools do. It's dependent on population density.
I'm not positive on that. Actually, we get the small schools grant right now.
Yeah, it's not exactly a one-to-one. I was going to try to look it up, but I can't because of my internet thing. I couldn't look it up, but you might not get the small school weight. The weight is dependent on being in a population density area of 55 people or fewer per square mile. So for example,
been to Roxbury, that may actually be the case.
Okay, so it might, but I know ACSDs, none of the small schools would get the weight in ACSD because of population density. So that's just one point I wanted to make, and I can look it up for you after we're done here and email you. But I'm curious about the sort of tension between the overburden of reporting, which I totally hear you about, and some of the things that Jeff was saying about accountability. And so how do you balance those two? Because we all want to make sure that whatever we implement actually does lead to equity, but we're not going to know if it does unless we, put some strings and some reporting back to us. So how do we find that balance?
I think when I'm talking about the burden that a grant would give us, that's where the burden was coming in when I was discussing the actual grant, is more on administration of a grant system. The agency often puts a lot of administrative hurdles in the grant process that make it very cumbersome to ask for the money. And actually Title III, which is the grant for English language learners, in a district such as mine, would qualify for approximately $8,000 for Title III. And we say, no, we're not going to ask for that money because it's too much effort. I mean, we'd spend $8,000 in per diem just asking for the money. So that's where the burden for me, I think it should be a lot of accountability in regards. I'm not sure what that would look like based on what the agency currently has for their capacity for how we support our learners. But we do have ed quality standards, and it should probably be based within there. But I hear you. I would agree with what Jeff said, and I believe Peter said as well, around increasing the capacity for the agency to provide high quality accountability and support to districts so that the funds are spent appropriately.
Okay, well, if you can, as superintendents, think about that question a little bit more, because I think this is a tension that we're always trying to figure out, that balance between state and local control, the balance between too much paperwork and not enough accountability. And if we're going to shift around, and I so appreciate that you're all using the term tax capacity, that makes me so happy. Thank you. But if we're going to shift around tax capacity and potentially put a lot more resources into the system for some school districts, how do we balance that? And if you all have direct recommendations for that, I think we all would appreciate that. It's a struggle to find, and especially coming from this group that would have to actually literally do the work. What would you recommend would be helpful to know?
And one of the issues we face is we can put money in the budget for personnel to do this. What we have a hard time doing is forcing the administration to spend that money. It isn't the first time that the legislature has said, we want you to hire people, and an administration has said, no. It's separation of powers. We can tell them they have to do this, and we can tell them what we want them to do, but there's limits to our ability to, much as we hate to admit that. Any other questions? Okay, thank you. And I'm going to move on to Jennifer, and I am not even going to try and do your last name because I've only hit names once this week without massacring them. So you just tell us how to pronounce your name for the record. I'll be in good shape.
Thank you, Senator Cummings. If you remember Bill Botso, he's my cousin, so Botso Jorns. You just add the Jorns to the end. So,
I did know Senator Botso. Okay, Botso Jorns,
representative from Pownell.
Yes.
So thank you for inviting us to testify. As a superintendent's group, we truly appreciate it. I'm in my 36th year of education. I work in the Kingdom East School District, serving as the superintendent, and we have 7 pre-K through 8 schools. We do high school choice for high school. We have about 1,800 students. We have about 330 square miles, and the sizes of our schools range from 55 to just under 500. So, equity is a significant public policy issue, and there's heavy political pressures, and it weighs often, as you know, the disadvantaged against all others. And I see the disadvantaged in my district every day, and I see the impacts of it. And each day we're working to shift that. And it's no question that we are one of the winning districts when you look at the equity and the weighting formula. And I just want to give you one example. We have currently 44 teachers with provisional licenses. What that means is that they don't have the correct licensure, and they have to take extra courses at the same time that they're teaching. And if you think about going into an emergency room and the doctor has her provisional license and the nurse, and how that impacts the quality of what we're able to provide, it's just one example why the weighting formula is so important. And I think everyone agrees with this, but I just need to give you that example. and I have hundreds more, but the weighting, when you look at the question of weighting versus cost equity or grants, I support the weighting approach rather than the cost equity approach. And because the research, the empirical research has shown that this is what works. And, I have this analogy that I brought with me, and I feel like the cost equity is a little bit like icing on a cake. Right. So you're adding the grant, and you could have a little bit of icing or a lot of icing, depending on what the political mood is in a year or two. Whereas the weighting is baked in. If you have chocolate and you cut the cake, it's still there, right? You still have your chocolate. And to me, that's the difference of the two, is that, the icing can be thick or large, depending on whatever the political pressures are. If you bake it into the formula, it's there, and it's always there. And you're always going to be serving the high need areas along with everyone else. So that's one, and one of the things I do want to say, and I want to just mirror what Libby said, is when I looked over the materials, one of the pros and cons, one of the cons was that the equalized pupil calculations are confusing to voters and the legislators. And I guess I don't think that's a good reason to not use it. And if you actually look at the funding formula, it's arithmetic. You add up numbers, you subtract, you do some division, you multiply by a fraction, you do some more division, so it's multiple steps, but it's a system that we have that we use, and our whole funding system is based on it. So if you take that piece out using the cost equity, then it has other unintended consequences. So I believe we should stay with that. You also asked about transition mechanisms and a timeline, and I agree with Libby and other folks about the timeline. And, one of the things that I see with Act 173 is that a decision was made and it just kept getting kicked down the road. And if you make a decision and say, okay, year one, this, year two, this, year three, this, it really is clear and people can plan, and the unanticipated challenges don't happen as quickly and as dramatically. And our district was an early adopter, not an early adopter, a voluntary merger. And we got the incentives, and the 864 tax incentives were a transition, and it was a very reasonable way to adjust. The one other piece that I want to address is this concept of the districts that are receiving and the use of increased resources. And, some have argued if regions are provided for, that the resources would be used solely to decrease tax rates rather than serve students. And I feel it's unfortunate that people make judgments about the commitment of the local folk to education. And I personally think it's unfair, because we're a high poverty region and our taxes haven't been high. And when we merged and we received the incentives, we spent it on, we got an athletic director. We now, every middle school child can run cross country if they want. We have advanced French, kids can get French in high school. We had a facilities manager. These are things that we've added, which has added to the quality of education. So I have many examples of how the local district who has these incentives uses it to really improve the quality of education. So in summary, just the 44 provisional license is just one example. When I worked in Chittenden County in a district, I was a leader there for, I think, 11 years. And I think I saw 5 people with provisional licenses over that time. So 44 in 1 year is a lot. And that's just one example. So, I believe in the weighting formula as opposed to the cost equity. I think it should be transitioned in. And you also asked one other question about ESSER funds. And my belief about ESSER funds is they should be used for one-time, not repeating purposes, so that they don't need to be backfilled. And I see that as things like helping figure out the teacher retirement, funding something such as this, facilities, which, many of our union schools were built in the 60s and 70s, and we've got a facilities crisis. Those are things that are real and hard and will be fixed. And when the ESSER money goes, you don't have positions that need to be filled. So that's the sort of the completion of my thoughts. And I did submit written testimony, which has a few more details, but I'm happy to answer any questions. And thank you for your time.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And for all of you, once we finish this, we'll probably be inviting you back. We've got the transition to work through, but we also have an evaluation process. It has, I guess the recommendation is some kind of a standardized test. But I think some of us who have worked with children realize that some of these kids need a lot of help and to getting ready to take standardized tests. And we're not quite sure, you know, we're coming out of a COVID where kids have had very erratic schools, and we're not sure how to fairly do that. And, you know, maybe we should kick it a couple of years down the road, but I think something maybe a little more complex than a standardized test might be in the works, but something to think about. Okay, I have Zach Mclaughlin is next.
Madam Chair, may I
Yes.
just jump in with a
I'm
question?
sorry, you've got a question. Yes, I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
thanks. And it's maybe a question for you, Madam Chair, or back to Jeff. But I'm curious, there's a very consistent message from our group of superintendents here. And I suppose my question is, did we invite superintendents that wanted to come testify in favor of the weights, or does this really represent where superintendents are coming from, having looked at it a lot and obviously knowing it intimately? I'd be curious if somebody could comment on that.
Okay, what I asked for, and I trust Jeff delivered, was superintendents that represented schools that would fare differently. I asked for a cross section. So I'm assuming we've got some folks that are, well, we already know that the Kingdom is going to make out better than they have. I am not seeing anyone from Chittenden, but I have a feeling we will have them in.
Well, Mr. Young is
Mr.
he counts.
Okay. Yes, he is. I'm sorry. Too much speed skim reading. All right. Okay.
Wait.
Other questions? Senator Hardy.
Just to answer Senator Pearson's question, yes, this is a pretty good cross section of the superintendents and the impact on various school districts based on my looking at these spreadsheets. And so I think Jeff did a really great job of getting us a diversity of perspectives, or at least a diversity of impact. So I would congratulate him for that. And thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to move on to Zach Mclaughlin from Springfield. Okay.
Thank you, Chair Cummings. I'll keep my stuff pretty brief because I appreciate Senator Pearson that it's feeling repetitive. And I think that
don't hear me saying that.
No, I mean that, and I don't mean that in a like you guys are droning on way. I mean, I think your observation, which is it sounds like the core message is the same, is accurate. Because it is, and I think that is representative of most of the vast majority of membership, especially on the narrow question he asked us to talk to today, which is cost equity versus the weights. I don't think you're going to find within our membership much of a lobby around moving to cost equity, and I think as Jeff pointed to some of the reasons, why. I think the kind of the thought process is that 60 and 68, have been battle tested. And there's been years of work connected with that approach. And I gave public testimony at one point around this to the task force where it was, this was like the shining moment for me, for you guys, because I've dealt with a bunch of situations, when I say you guys, the legislature, where well-meaning, well-intentioned policy didn't have the type of research behind it that this situation does, because you don't have full staffs. And so there's been some well-intended things, both on whether it's on the financial side or it's programmatically, where I'm trying to then deal with something that looked good on the surface, but then has a whole bunch of ripple effects in my organization that are difficult to deal with. And so when the legislature had the wisdom to say, we're going to actually do an empirical, we're going to have people do the thing that we would love to do all the time, and then come back to us with how the existing system would best serve the interests of what we're trying to do, which is to make sure all these different types of disenfranchised kids get what they need. It was like I was cheering, like, this is great, this is the moment. And then to have Professor Colby and our team do the work and then come back and say, look, here's using empirical evidence, this is how this should work. So for me, and then I think, and and I apologize, I'm the superintendent in Springfield, but I'm also the trustee of the southeastern part of the state. And I know what I'm saying, it represents what the folks in the southeast believe. Keeping the same system with those adjustments based on the work done by Professor Colby and our team feels like the right way to go, because again, battle tested system, research done around that area. And so if we were going to move to something new, I think people would want to see that we have the same depth of analysis that both Professor Colby's group has given us, and even though their scope was narrow, and the analysis that collectively we have, or the understanding we collectively have through experience of this long period of time that we've been utilizing this particular system. So, and I think what's up to this point, those two things, the depth of the work, both through experience and through Professor Colby's team, people are not confident, not because the task force didn't work hard, it did, but that those two, that the time frame that was available to those folks doesn't equal out the years of experience connected with the existing system and the other work. And if we're not sure, if we can't reasonably extrapolate that a major shift in terms of the structure of the system is definitely going to lead to significantly better outcomes in terms of what we're looking at, then most of our membership is, why would we make that move? And that better to make the adjustments to the weights, and then we'll see. And there are going to be differing fallouts around the system, and it's not as easy as, and I appreciate this, it's not as easy as going to the appendix in the report and saying, well, this is I'm a winner, I get this, or I'm a loser, or and it's slightly, in Springfield it's slightly different based on the two models, but Springfield would be a winner. But it also is, once, I think the real game is around this ELL conversation. And because it is such a significant impact to the Ed Fund as a whole, it's hard to separate out that piece that you guys have separated out and to have this dialogue without knowing that that's looming in the background someplace. And these are really, you really can't separate it out. And I know the fear, and I've talked to some people, some of my own delegation, the fear is that if you go fully with the weighting for those kids, it's going to suck the air out of what the impact that some people think are coming for their students in poverty is going to get washed away by what's going to happen in terms of those kids who need additional services because they're second language learners. But I think at its core, I mean, our membership, I think, understands and supports the idea of empirical research that has led to this basically an understanding that we need to make a huge commitment to those students. And regardless of the impact on people's individual systems, educational leaders across the state are looking at this and saying, this is a moral issue. And yes, it will have different impacts on a variety of different places. I'll pay in the town in which I live, my taxes will go up. But this is necessary if we really believe what we claim we believe as a state, that it would be necessary to have this occur. So I think what you're hearing, the repetitiveness is that it is pretty much the consensus of superintendents across the state that this is the approach on the narrow question you're asking us, cost, equity, or weights. I think it's generally the consensus of the group that weights is where we should be.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, thank you. And this is one of the days I'm glad we are doing Zoom, because I'm not worried about all of you having to drive. It's still snowing in Montpelier. Senator Hardy.
Yeah, that's why we got so many superintendents, because they all have snow
have
days.
to drive.
Sorry, my internet is funky. So Zach, thank you for your testimony. You did mention, and maybe Jen also did, this sort of outcomes question. And as you guys know, the study was based on like a very, very narrow outcome of just standardized test scores. So Senator Brock and I in particular, who's kind of been in and out as well, are very interested in an evaluation mechanism that looks at a broader set of tools than just those narrow test scores. So I'm wondering if you all, in addition to this, the sort of accountability, could give us some ideas about what we should add to that list of evaluation mechanism markers. You know, there are some graduation rates has been suggested, the student blanking on the term, that the survey of student
Oh, yeah.
you all know what I'm talking about.
No, sure. It's a cultural survey, but it's social emotion. Some of this stuff.
So, yeah. And I'm blanking on the name of it, but that survey, sort of course, grades, et cetera. But, something that we could use as an evaluation tool that's broader than simply test scores, but is still measurable and something that you already all do somehow. So I guess that's homework I would give you.
I think I've indicated we will have them back to do that. We didn't give them a warning for today. So I'm going to try and keep today on today's topic, and then we will have everybody back, or everybody who wants to come back, or you can just send in written testimony, best thoughts as to how we evaluate the effectiveness of this program and perhaps how often we should do it. Okay, so I'm going to move on. This is where I have to start making changes. David Young.
Yep. Thank you very much. Thanks for taking the time. Again, David Young from South Burlington. Spent about half of my time here in South Burlington, and the other half has been in Franklin County. So have a little bit of, some contrast there. Again, I've been here coming on my 33rd year. Going to be fairly repetitive to my colleagues. I think we're all on the same page as far as we believe strongly in equity dispersion through resources and systems that support them. I similarly support the weights over the cost equity model. But I'll be a little bit more redundant here in some of those. As a school district, we would see a reduction. And again, we still support that. Where I begin to probably deviate and would ask for additional thoughtful clarity is around the transition plan that was also mentioned by my colleagues. Anytime you try to implement anything, particularly in the education funding model, many of you know we have adopted budgets and sent them to the printers, and we're preparing for town meeting. Yet we have high level of volatility between yield and common level of appraisal. Equalized pupils, are continuing to move around. And any of you who've been part of a multitude of businesses or in education know that it's very difficult to try to make changes. And certainly on top of that, when you have the pandemic, it adds a major layer of complexity to us. And so for me, a big part of that, and Jeff said it earlier, on the velocity, if I think he used, of the economic current conditions that are upon us is probably at paramount than many of us have ever seen. So to me, I would highly recommend a transition plan that allows for those that need the resources to make those adjustments to have them, but not necessarily make the downward adjustments to those that would see an immediate decrease, and phase it in over a 4 or 5 year period or what have you, to allow that to occur. Again, I do want you to be really thoughtful around some of the things that are happening that I mentioned earlier. The yield dollar and the determination to hold back or to include. We're still not really sure. Our common level appraisal here in South Burlington, we're different than in other communities. We've had almost in a 2-year period, a 31% variation. And those of you who know how the model works has a major, major impact on that tax calculation. Or I can translate that to the ability to pass your budget and or the ability to carry out the services needed for your students. I also want to just second in on the AOE resources. I think, as Jen said, it is a fairly understandable education finance model, although there are some intricacies, for instance, in the equalized pupil calculation, and God bless Brad James, but all of us, have a hard time really doing any sort of affirmation of that work, right? It's a spreadsheet on top of a spreadsheet on top of a spreadsheet, difficult. And so when you talk, or Jeff or others talked about monitoring, in order to monitor, you need to be able to have access to, not change, but you need to have access to and the ability to understand it. And so my desire would absolutely echo getting AOE some additional support so that we then can determine equitable measures and be able to monitor the changes. I know there was a question, I think Senator Hardy asked around evaluation, and sure, we always go to academic. I know that she was asking about that, and you're right, academic is an import to our EL population, but one of the most important factors are participation, our ability for our kids to develop dispositions, to be lifelong learners, or that personal development asset, or those citizenry types of things. Inclusion and co-curricular activities or clubs and those types of things are critically important in the success pathways that we know for our kids. I certainly support the weights. Love to see a transition plan. Love to see something that doesn't come out that then puts significant pressure on any of us, those that have to either come up with the resources to make it happen, or those that have to reallocate resources. And if I do, often I'm going to have to probably reduce resources, those same resources that add to participation and success outcomes for kids. So the transition plan is important to me, and certainly happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Okay, any questions? I am not seeing any. So I'm going to move on to Emily Nisley.
Nice.
Did I massacre you?
Only slightly, and I'm quite used to it. No worries at all. It's Emily Nisley.
Nisley. Okay. Long I. All right. So the floor is yours.
I'm Emily Nisley. I'm the superintendent for Orange East Supervisory Union. And for geography, I serve Thetford School District, Blue Mountain School District, Oxbow Unified School District, and Waits River. And I'm going to cut short some of the pieces I was going to talk about here in favor perhaps of some others, but I certainly share the sentiment of my colleagues that I support the Waits. But what I thought might be useful for the committee is to talk a little bit about my SU, because it's somewhat unique in that the impacts of the Waits would play out very differently in different districts across my SU. And just to reiterate what has already been said about transition planning, that's certainly something that I fully support. Transition planning, ideally with some notice. And I bring up the point of notice because what I'd like to talk about is 173 and our transition right now that we're contending with on 173, going from a reimbursement model to a grant model. And for us, that's been challenging because we haven't had notice of that in a specific financial way. And so we're engaging in making those shifts now. And it's playing out as a pretty significant loss in revenue to some of my local school districts. So Thetford specifically is looking at a loss of about $200,000 in local revenue. Oxbow Unified, which is my larger one for Bradford and Newbury, is looking at a loss of about 562. And we haven't been able to plan for that over a series of years, right? So we're having to absorb this right now. And that's, Thetford is in a good place to absorb that. Oxbow, not as much. So if you look at how the changes in the weights would impact those two districts, Thetford would see about, and these are rough, but about a 20% loss in equalized pupils, roughly a 50-cent tax increase if it happened all at once. Newbury, on the other side, would see about a 20% increase in equalized pupils and about a 22-cent tax decrease. And, you know, there are, to be frank, major differences in the resources that are available in the Thetford school system versus the resources that are available in the Newbury school system. The things that the things that Thetford would be looking at cutting if we were making, you know, if we were having to adjust in Thetford for the decrease in local revenue for the transition to 173, we would probably be looking at cutting enrichment, which, and you know, to David's point, are important, but we'd be looking at cutting things like enrichment or gardening support that we have that are wonderful things. To make those adjustments in Newbury, we would be looking at cutting reading teachers and math interventionists and kind of the very things that we really need right now in the pandemic. And so I really support creating a model in Vermont that's equitable, a school finance model that's equitable, that makes up perhaps for some of the historical differences that we've been experiencing. But I would like to see a plan for how we're going to do that, because as we all know, the sudden changes that create havoc in our local budgets and our local communities, and quite frankly, cause frustration with the legislature, cause frustration with the state, you know, anything that we can do to help remedy that, I think would be very useful. And so, yeah, I think that's a little bit about what it looks like from my perspective. And I would certainly be happy to talk about that in any detail. I also would be very interested in talking about what perhaps the mechanisms could be that could be built in, perhaps something around per pupil spending, and there being kind of a minimum spending floor that could be worked in over the course of a couple of years, creating something akin to maintenance of effort in some of the school districts that may see more money coming their way, that we could in fact make sure that some of that is being invested in the things that those districts truly do need. But again, happy to answer questions and happy to talk about some of those things more specifically at a later date if appropriate.
Okay, definitely will. Senator Hardy.
Thank you. Madam Chair, I'm sure you're going to ask me to put a pin in this one, but since Ms. Knisley, did I say that right? Knisley brought this up. So regarding the maintenance of effort and the spending floor, this is something that the task force struggled with and debated. And, you know, that sort of is counter to what your colleague, Ms. Botzerjorn, was saying about sort of local decision-making about how to spend the money. Or at least it could be, depending on how we might think about it. So I guess I would really love to hear another thing from your group is like, where's your tolerance for that kind of maintenance of effort spending floor thing? And this is a question for you, Emily. So I'm asking because you just, and then Jen, if she wants to, but you're muted though.
Yeah, so here's part of the intricacy of that for me. So right now, when I'm looking at Oxbow Unified, which is looking at, again, having this $560,000 loss of revenue. what we're looking at is, okay, part of the transition for 173 in our initial thinking included the weights. The transition to the grant funding, the block funding model, from in 173 from the reimbursement isn't being coupled in at the same time with the weights, right? So we're saying, okay, we know that we have this, what perhaps will be temporary shortfall of $562,000 to the local budget. We're looking at that and saying, okay, we have an obligation to students through IPs, through other things that we need to provide certain services. We're looking at how do we use ESSER funds to bridge that gap. But we know that we're only setting ourselves up for a problem down the road. So in my district in particular, I see any increase that we would gain from the weights helping to fill that type of hole and not necessarily being credited back as a 20-cent tax decrease. I do agree with Jen in many ways that our communities do want to invest in some of these things. But to be frank, what I also worry about is what the CLA looks like in that year, and what the yield looks like in that year, and what the possible perfect ed finance storm is in that moment. And so that's why, if I knew my yield was good and I knew my CLA was good, I'd feel better about it. But is there something that we could do to ensure that that those things are there? And I don't know if that's a too roundabout way answer, Senator Hardy.
Okay, and Superintendent Batsajohn, did you have a response to that?
Sure. My comments mirror Emily's in that there are two parts to it. I mean, I did give examples of how communities can make local decisions, but I'm not opposed to a lower and upper thresholds, guardrails, as it were, some sort of mechanism for that. I think that that's a fine idea. I just also believe that we do have to trust that local districts will make decisions. So I agree with Emily.
Okay, but the upper lower thing you're okay with as long as we set it appropriately. Okay, thank you.
But the thing we've learned is that this is not the only moving financial piece. We are seeing major shifts in many, if not most, grand lists, which is playing havoc with the CLAs, that there are towns having very different experiences in some superintendencies and we have also hit you with the new grant system for special ed, which is going to have different impacts on different schools. And I think we've recognized as a general principle that education, in order to proceed smoothly, needs a smooth funding system. That's always been the argument for the property tax, because it was less volatile, except this year, than income. So we need to find a transition that will allow you, that will smooth the bumps and give you predictability, so that when you go to your voters, you're not saying, oh, there's we've lost $50 million this year, and so your tax rate's going up, who knows how many cents. That we need to find a way to walk this through and be cognizant of other issues that are also impacting your local budgets and tax rates. I think that's the other message I'm hearing. Correct me if I'm wrong. Okay. Other questions? Emily, did we interrupt you before you finished?
No, thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay, thank you. Okay, then we are going to Lynn Codem for wrap up. All right.
Hello there.
Hello.
Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Lynn Codem, the superintendent for the Franklin Northeast Supervisory Union. My supervisory union consists of 2 member districts, and we serve around 1,900 students in 9 schools. We have a career technical center and 1 virtual academy. Our towns are mostly rural. We support, many of our schools have students and families that have high levels of poverty in them. Our free and reduced lunch eligibility rates, our poverty rates range anywhere from 40 to 98% in our communities. So historically, our per pupil spending has been consistently well below the state and county average and near the very bottom of the per pupil spending comparison data for the state. I'm wondering if I could quickly just share a visual with the group. Would that
Yes,
be possible?
that's fine. Do you cover Swanton? Just
Do not, no.
do not. That's west. Okay.
Yes.
So I don't have a vested interest. My grandsons live in Swanton.
Okay. I gotta find the share button. There we go. Okay, can you see the visual?
Yep.
So as you can
There it
see,
goes. That's better. Yeah.
this represents the FY22 per pupil spending comparisons for towns across the state of Vermont. So you can see the systems that I serve are the Northern Mountain Valley Unified Union School District down here, and the Enosburg-Richford Unified Union School District down here. So you can see as you compare the per pupil spending throughout the state of Vermont, we're significantly lower than the Vermont state average, and we're even lower than the Franklin County average. And we consistently, our spending comes in very near the bottom of per pupil spending across the state. So that hopefully just gives you a little bit of context about the system that I serve. So to Emily's point about the spending floor, I think that, there is something to be said for that. I'm not sure if it's a spending floor on per pupil spending or if it's a spending floor in terms of the tax rate. So it's just something to consider. So as a result of our per pupil spending, we've had really limited capacity to add or build new programs and opportunities for our students, to fund additional staff members for these programs, and to provide our students with more equitable access to experiences that some of the other districts have been able to provide. Additionally, our spending constraints have made it really hard for our school boards to be able to compensate our staff in a way that is competitive with other systems across the state, which has made it really challenging for us to be able to make progress in any issue, as our pattern is that we're turning over about 20% of our professional staff each year. And as we're trying to fill those positions, it's most common to have between 0 and 3 candidates for any one of those teaching positions. So to Jen's point about the number of teachers on provisional licenses, there's a report that comes out from the AOE every year, and we are in the top 2, 3, or 4 in the state in terms of the number of provisionally licensed teachers we have. So that has a pretty profound impact on our students. Fixing the equity issue as envisioned by the task force, either with the weighting or with the cost equity payments, will benefit both of my districts and give us the opportunity to build a stronger and more equitable system for the benefit of our students. I think the task force has done a really good job of identifying the pros and the cons for the 2 systems. My colleagues and you and your colleagues may not agree on which factors are most important. One other factor that I wonder if it would be helpful to compare between the 2 models would be the factors that create greater stability around funding for our system. So is there one that could keep tax rates more constant from year to year? I understand the concerns of many legislators around these changes and providing communities with a temptation of using this transition to cut taxes rather than to increase opportunities. Over the past 3 years, as we've been preparing for this shift, I've had a significant number of conversations, and we've done a lot of work to prepare for this move within the districts in Franklin Northeast. I'm confident that our boards understand that this opportunity is one that is incredibly important for our students, and that they will not be tempted to use this as a mechanism to drive tax rates down. They're poised and ready to take this on in terms of really trying to leverage more opportunities and create greater equity for our students. But ultimately, as you all understand, that is up to the voters under our current funding system. I believe that you all, in your capacity as legislators, do have mechanisms that could ensure that we don't lose this opportunity throughout the state. I do appreciate both the logistical and the political concerns around developing a phased-in approach for districts that would see either an increased tax rate or a programmatic cut. I believe something has been lost in the discussion of winners and losers, though. So when you think about the context of the students I serve, some of them have spent their entire career in school systems under a flawed funding model. So a senior graduating this year has spent 15 years in a system. I'm sorry, lost my place. A senior graduating is leaving a system that has been shorted many millions of dollars since they enrolled 13 years ago. And yet he's being labeled a winner. And a student entering high school next year has spent 9 years in an under-resourced school. So in my districts, I don't think it's a stretch to put that dollar amount at 10 million or more. She, however, still has another 4 years with us. So again, I understand the needs around the stable transition. I encourage you to find a way to create a transition plan for those with decreasing tax capacity without delaying for those who have gone without for much of their careers. Are there other ways to cushion for the lost tax capacity for those systems with higher spending through the use of categorical aid, pandemic relief money, or using that excess money in the education fund? Again, my districts would do better under the cost equity model payments, but I understand there are other systemic considerations that are more important as a state. And I think it's important that we take those into consideration and would therefore support the weighting model. I could logically support either model based alone on its impact for FNE issue, but I do believe that the weighting model is preferred. Whichever model you ultimately choose and whatever transition mechanism you do put into place, I think the most important point here today is that you move quickly and you don't let the inequity of the current system linger any longer. It's long overdue. So I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today, and I do welcome any questions.
Okay, thank you. So your request is that we also consider, when we're talking about transition, that some of these schools have operated with less state support than they should have had for years, and that we not deprive their ability to move forward. On the other hand, if we gave you all the money at once, do you think you could hire the teachers?
I think that we're going to struggle with hiring right now. I just think that we need to be thoughtful about it. I don't think all of the money necessarily would go into hiring more teachers. I think one of our big priorities right now is stabilizing our workforce, because everyone has teacher shortages around the state, and the discrepancy between what we're able to compensate our teachers varies drastically. So I think one of the efforts that we would prioritize is to become more equitable in terms of our compensation with our educators. So I think hiring new teachers is one factor, but it's not the only one.
Okay, so you would like to also work on a more equitable wage or competitive wage.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I did hear, I don't think it was in your district, of a teacher who'd been there for 13 years. This was a couple of years ago, but was making around $30,000 a year. I doubt that's competitive. Questions for Ms. Codem. Senator Brock, I see your hand and your picture. I don't see Senator Brock, so I don't know if I've missed that. I know he's had a couple meetings, other meetings this afternoon. So Senator Pearson.
Maybe more a comment than a question, if you'll indulge me, Madam Chair. I was among a group of legislators that met with Ms. Codem and others before session from a handful of districts. And I sort of was tapping my screen, if you like, midway through, because I thought, wait, is this a call with the union? And the it was a very forceful call because it was an alarm among school leaders of the intensity of the needs right now. And just personally, it was helpful. My wife is a high school teacher at CVU, not exactly a district that we worry about their resources. But you helped me explain some of the intensity that she's been describing in a very straightforward way, and so that was personally very helpful. And as I'm listening to this conversation, I've been trying to understand the dynamics at play for the last month. I really just want to express my appreciation for the partners that we have here in the leadership of schools across the state. And I really, first of all, I appreciate it because you're the only group testifying that hasn't made me more confused. You've been very clear where you're coming from, and that means a lot to me. And I guess I just, there's just a number of factors at play. I am quite convinced we will not get this perfect, but what I'm hearing is a crystal clear call to do something, to make improvements, and to keep focused on those student needs that too often when we're describing policies, we think of what they look like on paper, and you've helped to make that clear. So I just want to express my appreciation, and it's just been very helpful to me this whole afternoon. Thank you very much.
Any other questions? Senator Hardy, I'm going to see if anyone else has a question beforehand. Senator Brock, are you there? Okay, he's still got his hand up, but he's not there. So Senator Hardy.
Well, I just sort of want to echo what Senator Pearson said, and thank you all for being here on a snow day to talk with us. And Jeff, I reread your testimony that you gave to the task force on our last meeting when we had you in to respond, and it sort of left us hanging, and this was what I needed for closure on that testimony. And so I really appreciate that you got this group of people together from a diversity of districts to talk to us, and agree with Senator Pearson that your united front is helpful in our efforts. So thank you. And I do hope to hear more from you on the questions that I asked.
Okay, and as we go forward, this may be the easiest decision we've got ahead of us. As we go forward, I'm sure we're going to call on Jeff, and he'll be calling on many of you as we work out the transition so that we get help to the schools that need it as quickly as possible. And at the same time, limit the blow. I think I've gotten the message that we need to look at a variety of issues as we go through that. The CLAs that are going to be popping up all over, the special ed funding, and take a look at the totality and see if we can come out first with a transition that works. We do have a surplus. I don't think we're going to be able to give it all back, because I think that may be what we need to use to step this in. And then we're going to need to work with you on an evaluation tool. And how do we do that? Stepping, how we evaluate how well this is doing. And you help us, I think, understand the reality of the students you're dealing with. For some kids, it's a major achievement to be able to sit in a chair for 20 minutes. And for other kids, it's learning to read. And for other kids, it's excelling. So finding a measure that doesn't just measure the top, but measures progress that you're able to help these students with, to me would be very helpful. So something to think about. It's still snowing in Montpelier, so drive carefully. And thank you. Any thoughts, anything, email it to us. You can email it to Faith. I know she's been in contact, or to Jeff, and he can mail it to us. And, things you think we should consider. This has been probably one of the most helpful groups that we've had to take testimony on, so or with or from. So thank you very much. And since it's a snow day, I think my grandchildren are downstairs and I haven't seen them in a long time. So I'm going to go say hi.
Ending live stream now.
Thank you. Okay.